bear with us and we will get started soon. Okay, I also want to let you know that we are opting to record this session today. There are a few people who haven't managed to join us, so it's going to be great that we're going to be able to share these resources with everybody. So I just want to make you aware of that record has been hit. We hope you're fine with that. I am going to get us started. So welcome everybody. I'm Lisa Farrell. I'm the Ambassador for Equity, Diversity and Inclusion with the IoD Aberdeen and Grampian Branch. And I'm delighted to welcome you all today. I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation. I am not usually someone who thinks before she speaks. I prefer to go with my gut and my instinct, and that doesn't always serve me well. But I'm sure our speakers today are going to offer us lots of ideas on how we can address that and manage any reputational risks that might be associated with our communication. This session has been sponsored and made possible by the Kaleidoscope group, and I'm delighted to be hosting this session with two wonderful people. So Dawn Bryan is Senior Vice President for the Kaleidoscope Group, and she oversees the work's global client practice with over 30 years of cross-cultural experience, lived in many countries, and is certainly going to bring a fantastic lens to this conversation. And Sarah Black is a communications consultant and has also 30 years. 30 must be that magic number. 30 years of communications experience, including board director for a global PR and content agency, and also as a fellow of the Chartered Institute of the Public Relations Institute. So I think that what Sarah and Dawn bring is they unite in their ability, I think, to bring people together and promote dialogue. They've both got a passion for the appreciation, I think, of cultural difference and creating strategies and interventions that really allow you to practice within that culturally diverse and complex environment. So I think we're in for a really fascinating session. I think it's safe to say we're in safe hands. So I am now going to hand over to Dawn and Sarah. They're going to talk us through some really important ideas, and then we're going to have time for a Q&A. And once we get to that segment, what I'd say is, please use the chat function if that's where you'd like to raise your questions, but also we have an opportunity for you to raise your hand, come off mic, and come talk to us. We always like to hear from you. So without further ado, Dawn, Sarah, it's over to you.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and it is great to be here. So welcome. It's nice to see your faces. We love seeing your faces. So if you're in a place where you can turn your camera on, please do. It makes the conversation a little bit more intimate. So we are, and less like a presentation. We do want this to be a conversation today. So we are want to start out by acknowledging that the topic today is potentially vast and definitely complex. So we're all human, and our responses to much of what we see and experience in the world around us naturally provokes an emotional response. I think Sarah said in one of her LinkedIn posts recently, it sometimes feels like the whole world is on fire. And we're living through a year when more than 50 countries will have some sort of election, parliamentary or presidential. And at the moment, the world is facing the highest number of violent conflicts since the Second World War. And 2 billion people, that's a quarter of humanity, live in places affected by conflict. So we're living in an era of culture wars, pervasive social media activity, heightened polarization, and cancel culture. That's our context.
And on top of that, what we are seeing is a huge amount of pressure on leaders, no matter what size your organization is, whether you're a solo entrepreneur, whether you're leading a multinational, whether you're leading an NGO. There's data from sources like the Edelman Trust Barometer that are telling us that businesses and then NGOs are the most trusted sources of information for people, and that actually potential employees want organizations to have a position on social issues. And that therefore has an impact on employment, on talent management, and on recruitment. There's also that sense that if one organization is saying something, it's hard sometimes not to say something. And part of the cancel culture that Dawn has talked about that we're all living in at the moment is sometimes it feels like you're as likely to be called out for saying nothing as you are for saying something. And I think for a lot of leaders, there's a real fear of, I don't like the words right and wrong, because I don't think it's ever that simple. There's a lot of fear about speaking out, and perhaps saying something that doesn't land the way that you intended it. And because of all the issues that Dawn's mentioned already. So as you said, it's very complex. It's very nuanced. There's no way we're going to cover it all. We could spend 3 days together, and I don't think we would have covered it all. Not that that wouldn't be lovely to spend 3 days with all of you. We've had fascinating conversations, debates, discussions in preparing for this session with you. It's been a fascinating process for me, and I hope it has been for Dawn as well. And I'm sure that we're going to learn more from our conversation with you as well. But because of the scope of this, one of the things we wanted to try and do to try and make as best use of your time as we could was put some parameters in place around what we're going to try and cover today, and be very focused. Otherwise, as I said, we'll be here for 3 days.
So our focus today will really be on leaders. So whether that's, your role, you might be the CEO, you might be a solo entrepreneur, you might be someone that a team looks to for guidance, or somebody that's here because you need to give leaders guidance. So we want to really speak about when leaders are speaking out on behalf of the business on social issues, and how that might impact your commitment to build an inclusive workplace or build an inclusive community. So as Lisa said, Sarah brings considerable expertise as a communications professional on this topic. I've been working for a number of years as a consultant to organizations who are dealing with this. And so today what we're going to do is just share some of the things that we've learned and observed. But as Sarah also said, we want to learn from you. And have you learned from one another? We know that there are likely people here today who have given this topic a lot of thought and perhaps learned things by experience that we could all learn from. So ultimately, today's lunchtime session, we're all learning together. Sarah and I are big believers that the more brains, the better. And so we want to bring your brains into this conversation. And so please use the chat, come off mic at the end so that you can share what you've learned with us. So this topic is one that, especially in the last 4 years, has come up a lot with our clients at the Kaleidoscope Group. And while we always advise clients to be thoughtful and considered, we would never give clients blanket advice to never speak out on social political issues. Our advice is to make sure that they have clear rationale and criteria in place to help them determine when they will. And that's really what Sarah and I want to do with you today. Determine the rationale, the criteria for you making this determination so that you aren't tossed wildly along with society from one crisis to the next, not knowing whether you should or shouldn't speak out. And so, what do we mean by a social issue? So for the purposes of today, we're going to define this as something that happens in the world or society around you. It's beyond your or your organization's control. It's topical, urgent, potentially far-reaching. It provokes a strong emotional reaction. Often that emotion is anger or fear. People tend to react rather than respond to these kinds of things. And there are typically polarizing opinions, which means that people within or connected to your organization will also have those polarizing opinions and be divided. It's the social issues we're talking about are those that are widely discussed in media, maybe in the public community, and potentially with a huge social media impact. And some examples of these might be political events, wars, civil unrest. You can think back to even this past 12-month period and imagine some of those things that would count as this.
And we were talking about defining this. We also thought it was important to kind of put some parameters on what we're not talking about today. So we're not talking about organizational crisis. where something has happened in your organization that has sparked headlines, controversy, discussion. For those of you in the UK, the post office is probably the example that everybody is thinking about. I think it's back in the news again today. Or advocacy. So that's when you might have a planned, as part of your mission or vision for the world, you might have a planned, sustained lobbying, public affairs, where you're advocating for a particular section of society or for the kind of business that you do. And I think the key word there is if it's planned. It's also, we're not going to talk about when your mission and purpose is around advocacy. I'm thinking of, or activism, thinking of brands like Ben and Jerry's, who actively advertise for sort of issues and advocacy managers, which seems a strange thing for ice cream until you think about who they are and what their purpose is in the world. And so that's something separate. Again, that's intentional, it's proactive, it's planned. And the other thing that which would be a fascinating conversation, but we didn't think we could get into it in enough detail today, are those times within your organization where maybe you see or hear something and you think, oh, that doesn't sit well with me, or I think that's maybe potentially offensive to my colleagues, or it's offensive to me, or I think it doesn't align with our policies, our values, or even our DEI commitments to being an inclusive workplace. That's another, it felt like to us that was another topic for potentially another day and for other voices. So also, what do we mean by speaking out? So it can be internal. A lot of times we think, well, I think you probably all think different things. I often think it's a tweet or a LinkedIn post, or it's something on social media. I think for a lot of us, that maybe is the default, but it can actually be anything. The purposes of today's conversation, we want to think about it being both internal and external. So it may be something that you say at a staff meeting. It might be something that you say within your organization's internal communication. It could be a blog. It could be even a verbal comment if you've got a big enough meeting. But one thing I do want to say is that anything you say internally can become very quickly an external piece of commentary. I think we've all seen leaked memos from various organizations in the news over the last 12 months or so. And also, if you're speaking out externally, the people who work with you and work for you in your organization are hearing it as well. And sometimes, well, we'll talk about there being no surprises later on, but it's very easy to think, oh, I'm just talking to this journalist, or I'm just speaking here, or I'm speaking on my own private, personal LinkedIn, my own platforms. But actually, there's a good chance that if you're senior enough, that actually people you work with are reading those as well.
And part of the reason why I think we all thought this would be such a timely topic is because it feels like there has been an increase in the pressure placed on leaders to speak out on these things. We've definitely seen an uptick in our firm with the number of leaders and organizations who've reached out to us for help about speaking out on these things. Sometimes they're asking us for guidance about should they or shouldn't they say something. Other times they're seeking support about the best way to frame a response and set it up for success. And then other times they're coming to us wanting help retroactively because the response to their response hasn't gone the way that they had hoped. And so we've really seen leaders and organizations get tied up in knots about this. And we love to help you so that you don't find yourself in the same place. We haven't seen it in my experience grind businesses to a halt necessarily, but it does take up significant time and energy and resources put into this that could be instead used getting business done. And so I think what makes this such a challenge for leaders and that Sarah and Lisa and I have all talked about in preparation for today is just how much pressure there is to speak, not to speak. There's pressure coming from all areas. And so sometimes this looks like employees or board members or investors, and they may want leaders of the organization to say something. And often these people are coming and putting the pressure on who hold opposite opinions of what should be said. And usually they're coming at it with some strength of opinion. So there can be this pressure from there. There's also, as Sarah mentioned previously, there's that pressure of watching peers or competitors. So when you see other people, maybe those you respect, or those with whom you directly compete, speaking out, there's this element of, oh, if so-and-so is responding, then I have to as well. Or there's oh, we need to get out there and say something before such and such does. So there's also pressure. We mentioned cancel culture. There's pressure from clients or your customers who might threaten whether they'll continue to work with you, depending on what you do or you don't say. And then there's also that personal pressure. You might feel strongly about an issue, maybe so strongly that it's visceral and you feel compelled to speak out. So whether it's from those external factors or from what's happening within you, we know that leaders are under enormous pressure to speak out on social political issues. But we also want to say pressure by itself is never reason enough to make a statement. So in addition to all the pressure, there are a few key challenges that leaders encounter when speaking out on an issue, and we want to highlight 3 that we've seen again and again and again, if we can help you prepare for those.
Right. So the first of these is around people. We're looking at this in the context of hopefully creating inclusive workplaces and inclusive communities. And so one of the things that comes up when you think about whether you want to take a position or say something is, how can you do that? Is it possible? It's not always to do that in a way that is inclusive of the experiences of your people and that is equitable in reflecting those experiences. Can you acknowledge and honor all the different perspectives that your people bring in a way that people feel valued, heard, and respected, whilst also doing something meaningful in the eye of the storm? I think that's one of the biggest challenges. The reality is that if people do feel that they are not seen or their experience is not valued, maybe not even validated, that can have an impact on the workplace in terms of how people show up, in terms of retention, workplace dynamics, recruitment, productivity. And one of the challenges is as well that even if you speak out in a personal capacity as a leader, most people are going to conflate that with the organization. And most people are going to not be able to separate the two things. It's very difficult to go, it's just my personal opinion, because of the position that you hold. And then you have to think about, how does that make people in the organization feel if you've had that visceral response and said something? Maybe the rest of your leadership team are like, oh, didn't know that was coming. And then their team have questions for them, and they maybe feel very isolated and unsure and perhaps even not equipped to deal with those. So that's really the big challenges that we've seen around how it impacts the people that are closest to you within your organization.
And the second one that we've seen again and again is that speaking out can set expectations and can get people caught up in a cycle of feeling like if they speak out on one social issue that they have to speak out on the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. And you can imagine there's criticism that comes if you respond to one, but not to the next one. And then if you respond to 2, right? If you get locked into responding to 2, especially that 2 that happen right on the heels of each other, but then you don't on the 3rd, then people will definitely take notice. And you might hear comments like, oh, you cared about that, but obviously not this, or you'd be speaking up. So, so that can be a cycle that you can find yourself getting stuck in. And we found this expectation setting is also not just about whether you speak out on multiple things, but also the speed at which you speak out. So people begin to watch your response time. And so if you respond quickly to one, and then there's this expectation that you will respond just as quickly to the next one. And so it becomes this cycle where you're always on high alert, watching for things that you should be speaking out on. And you can imagine, many of you, I'm sure, can think about even the things that are happening right around you, much less globally, that there are things that are happening daily. Hate between groups, marginalization of people, discrimination, all worthy to be spoken out against. But because there are so many things happening at any one time, it can be a full-time job, watching for them and responding to them. And then your attention is taken away from the business, from what you're meant to be doing. And instead you're on high alert, feeling like you have to respond to everything because you responded to something. And then people are also watching, once you've spoken up, how far do you step into the conversation? If you've stepped in quite a lot on one, then it's very difficult to, as Sarah says, tweet and retreat on another one. So part of getting it stuck in the cycle can be from feeling like you should be responding to something. There's a lot of feeling of obligation and a lot of times good intention, wanting to be inclusive and support others. But this cycle tends to happen because there's potentially not having a clear rationale to determine when and why you'd speak out. And without that clarity, people get stuck feeling like if they speak out on one, then they have to speak out on all of them.
And both of those challenges actually feed into the last one that we wanted to flag, which is really around reputation. For some of you, that might be brand value, depending on how you look at it. So the cancel culture isn't just the nastiness on Twitter or X, as we're calling it these days, but it can actually be shareholders, investors, your board of trustees, if you're in a nonprofit, your supporters, if you're a solo entrepreneur, might actually be uncomfortable with where you're going and what you're saying. And so there's a kind of a broader organizational issue there as well. It's probably also going to keep your communications team, if you have one, or your communications consultant, very busy and possibly a little stressed. One thing we did want to flag today is an area of personal risk or personal challenge to think about, which is how well equipped you are if you step into something that is controversial for whatever response there is. And you don't have to look very far to look at the kind of comments that people leave on other people's blogs, on their social media posts. The commentary is sometimes very difficult. And I know there are people on the call who have dealt with that. And it can be incredibly personally difficult to navigate that. There is a psychological impact to that. And I know definitely I have worked with people who have not thought that through and are then shocked by how difficult it is for them to cope with it. There's also reputational risk, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a second, about stepping into something when you don't actually know enough about what's happening or about the issues. And that can actually have a detrimental impact on your organization. And the last one, and Dawn has heard me say this many times, that your insides and your outsides need to match. If you speak out on something and your people's experience of working with you or working for you doesn't match what you are saying externally, you're going to have all kinds of issues to deal with. And also, thank you, great comment from Kath, that if you're talking about something that you don't know what you're talking about and people are directly affected by that who do have lived experience of it and have that dissonance and that gap, then you're also, I think, going to have reputational issues. A good one to look out for, it's not the kind of social issue we're focusing on today, International Women's Day and the gender pay gap bot on social media called a lot of people out for posting about fabulous things in their organization and then posting out the pay gap for women versus men in those organizations. So that's when it can become very difficult for everybody.
All right. So ways to respond. In the face of all of this, what can leaders do? So here's some of the good practice that we've seen and we would recommend you consider as you think about formulating your own ways to respond. So the first that we would say is to develop and use a framework that you can go back to again and again. This becomes your guide or your roadmap that clearly and objectively describes the conditions for when, why, and how you'd speak out if you chose to. So it's really important to develop or at least confirm this framework when you're not in the eye of the storm that Sarah mentioned. So when you're not under pressure is not the time to create an objective framework. Save that for, right now. This is a good time where if you're not in the eye of the storm to be thinking about this. And we've developed one that we're calling the 3Cs. And Sarah's going to tell us more about this 3C framework.
Yes, we do like a little bit of alliteration. It's easier to remember. So 3 things, and you can adapt this. It's not like this is not the ultimate answer. It's just to give you an idea of the kind of thing that we would work through with some of the clients that Dawn has worked with. One is around culture. So that's thinking about how these issues relate to the organizational culture. So whether that's looking at your mission, whether it aligns with your values, thinking about whether this fits with who you are as an organization. Looking at the impact that a statement might have on your people, as we've talked about already. And also things like, does your culture support open dialogue? Do you have high trust that if you step into an issue, you're going to be able to have open conversations in a constructive and meaningful way within the organization about the issue that you've stepped into? Will people feel we're being hypocritical, or is this true to the kind of organization that we are? Are there policies and practices in place to support not just what you're saying, but the sort of aftermath of you saying it in terms of people's reactions? Have you prepared the team so nobody's caught off guard? Is there anything that you are saying or doing that actually people feel unsafe, either physically or psychologically? And also, how are your comments going to impact your employees' relationships with each other, which goes back to that trust? What kind of conversations are you having in the business? Patagonia stepping into an environmental issue is very, very different and feel very different than that organization to perhaps somebody else in a more corporate organization stepping into something like that. Second C is cause. Do you actually know and understand enough about this issue to make an informed comment? Do you understand the myriad of different views? Because sometimes when we think about polarized, it's like one or the other. There's all kinds of shades of gray in there. Also, you're prepared to take action around this cause. I lived in the States for 7.5 years. And there was quite a lot of eye rolling during the time that I lived there about the phrase thoughts and prayers, because it would come out so often and then nothing would happen. So actually having substance behind your commentary. How can you step further into this cause in a way that's constructive? Are you going to have policies, financial packages? What's it going to look like? Finally, community, taking it outside the organization to look at the community you serve, customers, clients, suppliers. Again, that sort of sense of how does this ripple out into the community we serve? What's the response, and what's the wider social mood and social discourse around this issue? I think the key thing about this framework is just using it as a way to think through the implications. It's not like check, check, check. Okay, I can do this. I can say something. That's not how we would recommend you use it. It's really about weighing the consequences and thinking it through with other people, hopefully a diverse group of people. If this framework kind of leads you to a place where you're like, okay, I think maybe we are ready to do this. I think you'd be really clear about what your ultimate goal is in speaking out. Like, what are you trying to achieve other than so-and-so said something, so we should, and try and be really clear about that. And then also, how are you ready to handle responses to your position? Have you thought through what the reaction and responses might be? And are you ready to deal with those?
The second way that I think we can respond, and we've encouraged leaders to respond, even if they don't want to say anything. So you might run through this framework and say, actually, we're not ready. Well, that doesn't mean you don't do anything, right? So if you know there's something happening around you and the people who are connected to your business or your organization, then we would say, support your people, look for ways to support them. And when we say your people, we mean, some of you may have employees, some of you might not. It might be your colleagues, your team members, or it may be the wider community that you serve. And so if you feel strongly about something, it is likely that the people around you connected to your organization are feeling something too. A good phrase to remember is everyone's feeling something. And so go in with that knowledge and awareness. And if everyone is feeling something, rather than ignore that it's an issue, it's often worth just acknowledging that the situation is tough, that everyone is feeling something, that emotions are high, that responses are polarized, rather than pretending that nothing's happening. And so in light of that, we would say, also provide employees with, or provide your team with, practical support. So it might be, if you are in a situation where you have mental health resources that are there for people, to remind them of what is available for them, or the support services that might be adjacent to your organization. Maybe providing opportunities that they can access outside. So some of our clients pointed people to supportive webcasts that were done by other people, but said, hey, if you're thinking about this, there's this webcast that's happening, you can go attend that. We've also had clients who have hosted panels, just brought in subject matter experts or others to talk about things like psychological safety, how to have tricky conversations. What do you do when you're divided with someone? How do you find space to have respectful disagreement? What does that look like? So we've seen clients provide those kinds of things. Also providing just the contact details of people who will respond to questions or concerns if people have them. And then the last thing is to equip your people leaders, or the managers, or people in your organization who lead other people who might be feeling vulnerable, threatened, or having strong emotion. That's a useful thing to do no matter what is happening. It doesn't require a social political issue to happen to prepare your people who are leading others, but they definitely need to be equipped when the sort of swirl of social political issues are happening, because our workplaces are microcosms of society, right? Those societal issues walk through the doors just as your people do, or walk into, or spring into a Zoom room, just like real people. So skill up your people leaders to know how to self-manage themselves, right? So that they can support other people who may be struggling, often with potentially an opposing view that they have, and to do this without minimizing, without dehumanizing, or re-traumatizing.
And then also remind people what you stand for. We hope that you've got core values, whether you're an individual or a massive multinational, that you've got core values that you can point people back towards, that hopefully encourage people to remember that when things are very polarized, that you want your workplace to be a caring and respectful place for everybody to do productive work together. And also speak about what you're for. Root people back as far as you can into those values, into your DEI commitments, into the goals of being an inclusive workplace. Which doesn't mean that you don't talk about things or that you don't disagree to what Don's just said, but it is trying to gather around people around something that hopefully is shared, and hopefully makes the workplace a safe place for them to be in on a day and daily basis.
Yeah. And then the last point we would recommend to you is that you respond, don't react. We often find people wanting to leap in quite quickly, and we would say, don't, just hold. And we would say, be thoughtful. It doesn't mean you're slow, right? So sometimes it's not about the speed, but it is giving yourself time to review the framework, think back through those questions that Sarah brought up, follow that roadmap that you put together when there wasn't a crisis, right? That's what it's there for. And then Sarah mentioned a diverse group of advisors. Oh, if we could give you one piece of advice, whether it's just you as an individual, apart from business or apart from mission, we all should surround ourselves with a diverse group of wise advisors, including some who we know will disagree with us on important issues, right? This is absolutely essential for us as human beings. So consult that group of advisors. We would also say consult people from your community. So that's people, might be those employees or team members. It might be people that you serve, your clients. It might be your suppliers, but anyone who might be affected. Listen to what this experience is like, what their input is, and ask them what they need. Listen a lot to them before you speak to rush out. And then once you've reviewed your framework, you've and your criteria for speaking out. Once you've consulted your diverse group of wise advisors, and once you've listened to people, then we would say, determine thoughtfully what you're going to do, act on that decision, and then lead with strength. That is not the time after you've gone through all of those things, to waver, right? Your people don't want to see your wavering, fretting about with uncertainty about whether you've done the right thing or not. Just consider it thoughtfully, make the decision, do it, and then keep leading your business, keep leading your organization. Sarah, over to you.
Finally, Dawn asked for one last piece of advice, and I don't know whether any of you have followed the story about Elmo on Sesame Street, who tweeted, and he basically said, hey, as a 5-year-old would, which is, I've worked with Elmo and he is 5, you know, just checking in. And then people started to tell Elmo exactly how they were feeling. I think President Joe Biden got involved, celebrities got involved, and people got real very quickly. They just wanted to be asked how they were doing. So 2 things, be kind to yourself. There are awful, horrible things happening in our world that are genuinely heartbreaking. And no matter how you feel, that is hard to navigate, whether you're a leader, no matter where you are in the world. But also check in with your people, be more Elmo, no matter what the latest headlines are. I think we can all use with somebody, particularly those people that we work with day and daily, saying, you know, you doing okay? How are you? So I think make that part of your culture. And then when the hard times come, hopefully you do have that trust.
And I would say, I mean, the image that comes to me from what Sarah just said is Elmo wouldn't be canceling people. So I think there's something about being gentle, right? We have all realized how difficult this is. And so if someone speaks out, they have either gone through a similar process of trying to determine whether they will or won't, or they might have stepped fully into it without giving it thought. Either way, I think there's something about being empathetic about what they have encountered and what they are encountering, and so be gentle with other people, especially if they get it wrong. There's going to be lots of people out there who are canceling them, who are critiquing them, who are maybe even condemning them. And so we would just encourage you, the world has enough of that. Don't be part of it. Show them the compassion, the gentleness that you would want to receive if you were them. And so I think Lisa's told us to get those reflections and questions ready. So that's what we wanted to share with you. We hope there's some things of value here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dawn, Sarah. Really, really so many nuggets that I've taken away with. And while people are thinking perhaps about their own reflections and their questions, a couple of reflections, I guess, from myself. I love the framework. I think having something that you got objectively set out that was done, as you said, in a moment of peace, it is something that I think every organisation and individual could really take away. And I guess there was 2 things for me that I reflect most on is, one, I'm going to add a couple of C's to your framework, if that's okay.
Please.
Yeah, the ones that I think that resonate for me is, and you did mention it, is consequences. And we talked about this before. One of my good friends always said to me, Lisa, you can have freedom of speech, but you can't have freedom of consequences. So I think being able to wrap all of those things together when you've gone through it all, recognizing that at some point there's going to be a consequence to what you've said. But the other one that I want to add on, again, you know, just echoing what is the compassion part. We've all done something online at some point, whether it be a comment that we've added to a LinkedIn article, whether it be an article we may have written ourselves, that sometimes we don't get quite right. And you want somebody that's going to be a little bit kind, who maybe came, you know, behind the scenes, calls you in and says, you know what, that maybe wasn't the best comment that you made. Can I help you make it better? Or so that compassionate element, I think, is absolutely fantastic. And then the final reflection I had is that daring to disagree. Have people that you can speak to. I think that's such a fantastic piece of advice. I have two humans I speak to that I'm not ashamed to say I don't particularly like. I'm going to say that out loud, but I respect them. And they are there for me to challenge me. And we do it with respect, and we do it with kindness, and we do it with compassion, but we disagree with each other violently, but it makes us better. So I think that wise advice is just such a brilliant ad for each of us, I think, in terms of our networks. So I'm going to go to the chat now, and I think there's a few reflections there. Kath says, yeah, another one is coping strategies. Kath, do you want to say anything more about that? It's a great ad.
I could. I'm in a cafe, so I don't know if I'm making an awful lot of noise behind me. But yes, I would just say coping strategies are huge because this work takes consistent effort. If you are an activist, I'm an activist. I do LGBTQ plus inclusion work, so I'm all for speaking out. But some days I know it's not in my best interest to speak out. And if I'm going to be here for the long haul, I need to be able to maintain my own sanity, mental health and physical health. And actually sometimes I've worked out that not speaking out is more powerful because everyone expects us to. So I pick and choose what I speak about, and that becomes my coping strategy to have the maximum impact that I can. That's not detrimental to me or to other people.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that, Kath. I think such an important point to be kind to ourselves as well, isn't it? So no questions coming through just yet. I have had a couple sent in, but I'm going to ask this one, which is really around ultimately businesses are there to be in the business of making money, right? They're there from a commercial perspective. How would you recommend organisations might respond to a direct challenge on their commercial stance in a particular, their values, when they might operate in a country that is involved in a humanitarian or a political or a social situation that we don't agree with, and maybe some of our employees don't agree with. But ultimately, we're here to do business, right? How would you respond to that?
Sarah, I'll go first and then you leap in with your wisdom. I think first, I would hope and I would expect that if you're operating in a country that has a humanitarian or political situation that that you are first, if you've got people there, whether they're your customers or your clients or your colleagues, that you're checking in on their safety and their well-being. You're having conversations about their experiences around what's happening. The second thing I would think that you would want would be to seek input, right? So that you're well-informed, as well-informed as possible as you can be on the situation that's happening, including the complexities, right? The implications, maybe the potential impact on your people and the organization. I think that input might also involve legal counsel potentially. I don't know what the situation is, but if you are in a situation where there is this humanitarian crisis or political crisis, you may need to get some legal counsel about, are there laws changing, regulations changing? Are there, even are there ethical standards that you need to consider? So having the experts and the advisors. So there's something about having surrounding ourselves with that diverse group of advisors. And then there's also having subject matter expert advisors that are important in these. Those are the things that come top of mind for me. Sarah, how about to you?
And there's a couple of things, which is sometimes you do need to step back and re-examine your values and say, as a business, are we actually living our values? And are we living them out loud in the sense of we stepped into something here which actually it doesn't fit with who we want to be as an organization? And I think also there's a little bit of stakeholder mapping. So and maybe looking for that tipping point where the kind of reading the virtual room, as it were, where it's not actually sustainable for your business to work in that area. It might be a safety thing, it might be an environmental thing, but it may just be the people with whom you do business, whether that's clients, shareholders, stakeholders, whatever they may be, are just saying, no, this is a place that we are not willing for you to go with you. And so then it actually becomes a commercial issue, as well as a kind of a moral, ethical issue. I think those things are all in the mix. I think that being aware of the mood is very important. So one of the things that you'd be saying to organizations is you don't want to wait to the moment of crisis to be monitoring what's happening. So you need to be looking at trends, you need to be looking at what's happening in areas. If you're working in a place in the world that is likely to have a humanitarian crisis, you shouldn't be surprised by it. And so again, that preparation, that being aware of what's going on, having your metaphorical ear to the ground, I guess. But again, having those trusted advisors around you, having community partners, be paying attention to what's happening. And also there's a little bit of cultural awareness there, cultural intelligence. If you're sitting in one part of the world looking at another, trying to understand, it's very easy to make judgments from where you are and where you sit in the world. About how something's happening on the ground. And that's, again, the importance of listening and doing that with cultural sensitivity, and knowing that different people may talk about and communicate things differently. And so having that in your mind is all very useful.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. First question, we've got Leona. How do you support manage employees' political agency, that they're active and external into your organization, and how do you balance the boundaries and freedom of speech? That's a toughie.
That's such a great question. It makes me pitch it first to
question.
Sarah.
Oh, thank you, Leona. So I think there's so much there, isn't there? And I think part of this is what Lisa was saying about you can have freedom of speech, but not freedom of consequences. And that's always a tricky one. And I can think of organizations who've kind of swung too far, where they've just said to people, you can't ever tweet about your job. I think British Airways might have done that. Please don't quote me on that. I need to go and check. So I think maybe there are some things around code of conduct about having those conversations, where you make it very clear what's a personal opinion. And again, I think to help people understand that it's very hard to separate the personal and the professional these days. It's the curse of social media a little bit, that those things are hard to separate. But also I think it's one thing to have an opinion. I think working through as leaders some boundaries around, is it hurtful to other people? Is it misinformation? Like, is it just blatantly untrue? Are they sharing or reposting things that break confidentiality in your organization in any way? Misinformation is really, really tough. And there are some resources I'm happy to signpost to other people in the communications industry who've done more work on this. But one of them is if they are saying, X has happened, and the rest of the world's going, oh, no, I don't think it did. Or it to be factually untrue. Then I think that's a time where you have to step in and go, do you know what, you are speaking on our behalf, or it reflects on the organization. I think it's also to do with being able to have open and honest conversations, and calling people in, which as opposed to calling them out, where you can say, hey, I saw you said that thing and I'd like to know where that's coming from, or why do you think that, or can we talk about where that's at and where you've come to, how you came to that conclusion or that position. There's at least one person on today's call who's done that for me, and I'm very grateful. So those are the things that would immediately go through my head. It's a tough one as an employer. And I think process and protocol and having some policies and some honest conversations about that internally can be really good. Having a social media policy as an organization about both how you as an organization use social media, but also how anybody who is strongly identified with the organization might use social media. I think at least one of our political parties in the UK has had issues with that this week, possibly more if we consider MPs to be employees. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. It's a really great question. It's a really hard question, but thank you.
And I would add that it's really difficult for leaders to speak out on their to give a personal opinion. It's almost impossible to separate a leader from an organization. And so our advice to leaders often is be very careful, right? There is a responsibility that comes as a leader of an organization, understanding that you are seen often as the organization. So if you speak out, it's as though you are saying something on behalf of the organization that you lead. And so it becomes really, I'm not going to say impossible, but very difficult for people to separate those two things. And we've all seen examples of where a leader has spoken out with their opinion and then lost their job. So, again, there are consequences. The stakes are higher for leaders possibly than they are for maybe individual employees who are seen to be not representing, they're not assumed to be representing the organization, but a leader is. And so when something happens, it's good to have policies, as Sarah said. It's good to have that communication as a leadership team. All right, what are we doing? What are we saying? What are we not saying? What principles do we need to remember here as a team? And then moving forward that way. Otherwise, you're going to have potentially leaders pitched against other leaders. Well, they said that, but I don't believe that, and it becomes chaos.
You spoke right at the very start, about the Edelman Trust Barometer, etc. And what we are seeing is, a complete lack of trust in government and institutions around the world. So doesn't business have a responsibility to actually speak out, to try and affect change? And how do you balance that, with the S and the ESG and the DEI work that people, shouldn't we speak out as businesses?
Ooh. I think if we polled the room right now, we would have divided opinion.
Let's do that quickly then. Let's ask everyone to raise your hand if you think business should speak out, that they have a responsibility.
I'm going to abstain because my answer is always, it depends.
I know I'm abstaining too. And look, we've got some depends. Depends on the business, depends on what topic, it depends. Yeah.
So for the majority, it's sitting on the proverbial fence.
I think, and I think I was reading Kath's question in the chat, and these things I might try and tie them together, possibly very badly, in which case forgive me. Firstly, do believe in responsible business. Let's say that. Let's start with that. I think there's maybe a split between responsible action and responsible speaking out. And so there are things that naturally flow from culture and values. And if you are living those out loud, then there might be things that naturally flow out. But there is a danger around greenwashing, rainbow washing, where you are saying something for your marketing purposes that, that's not the same thing as actually having a deep commitment to making sure that your workplace is inclusive of anybody, regardless of, gender, race, religion, whatever it happens to be, all the ways in which we are all different from each other. And so I think there is a responsibility for businesses to operate in ways that are ethical and responsible, and that hopefully improve people's experiences of work and improve our community. And I think there probably are times where that may lead to speaking out, because it's within, if you like, their domain, their sphere of influence. It all aligns. And so it's the authenticity of who you are as an organization being lived out loud, as opposed to, we must say something about this because it's the issue of the day. Or we must say this because everybody else is doing Pride, so we should too. And then I think the example that one of the examples Kath mentioned was, you step into something, haven't thought it through, and you actually, because you pull back from it in the face of customer response, do a huge amount of damage to that community.
Yeah.
That is not responsible business. Going to get into trouble now with my opinions, but it's, to me, it's an authenticity thing. And so your mission, your vision, your values are your guide to where you speak out. It's not, we should speak out on everything. It's, we've really done deep work on this, and therefore it makes sense for us to speak into this issue in terms of what we know about it and our experience of it. I think there's been a lot of, and I know that some people who are on this call, I think, have sustainability, ESG experience. I think there's been a lot of organizations who stepped into that for marketing purposes or PR purposes, and speaking up isn't necessarily about your PR and your marketing. It's about something, I think, really fundamental to your DNA as an organization, or it should be, we hope.
And I would say that big organizations, right, they have power and influence.
Yeah.
That power and influence shouldn't just be wielded sometimes, right, as a weapon, because it can be, right? But that power and influence should be something that you demonstrate again and again and again, consistent to what your values are, consistent to what they're hoping to accomplish in the world, which we would hope would be good things consistently.
Yeah. And I think to Kath's point in the chat, that if you're living your values out loud and you're committed to a direction of travel, and have thought through the issues, then part of thinking that through is, if we do this and people walk away, you have to be okay with it.
We're okay with it. Yeah.
And you have to sort of, that's the sea of consequences and coping strategies. We're going to lose X% of our market because they're not going to love this, but we believe it's genuinely the right thing to do. And so that's part of, to me, a part of the framework conversation of thinking that through properly.
Great questions.
Fantastic. Well, I am going to slowly close us off, I think, a couple of minutes before the top of the hour, but just want to take this opportunity to thank both Dawn and Sarah for a really informative hour with us this afternoon. I think that framework is something that we can all take some learning points from. I think those 3 C's are probably going to stick in our mind quite a lot over the course of the next few weeks. I know that Dawn and Sarah would be delighted to connect with you, if not already connected with you on LinkedIn, and carry on the conversation if they can help you in any sort of way. I just want to say thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for the reflections and the comments that we received and the questions that came in. And it's been a delight to spend this hour with you all, and wish you a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you.
You all. Thank you so much.
I might not sound like it, but I am actually a member of IoD Aberdeen and Grampian, so I look forward to maybe seeing some of you in person at a future event. I got to Aberdeen as fast as I could, folks. That's all I can say. I'm staying. Now that I'm here, I'm staying.
Thank you for coming today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.